Now he's got a new book called Sovereignty or Submission. Will Americans rule themselves or be ruled by others? You may not pay attention to it in your day-to-day life. It's so much clutter out there in the news sometimes, but almost every year there's some kind of UN treaty on something or another that tries to make it through the United States Senate, where treaties have to be ratified, and they're almost always blocked from being passed, if that's what the word is. But still, these globalists, they're almost always far left ideologues who are pushing this kind of stuff, trying to get it through. And so we're discussing today about, John, has there been an example of one of these UN treaties making it passing and then being in conflict with the U.S. Constitution?
Yes, I can think of two. One was the Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. It's called CERD, S-C-R-D, the Race Treaty. And there's also a treaty on civil and political rights. Both of those treaties were ratified by the Senate with reservations. The United States said, we'll pass the treaty, but the reservations are nothing, and the treaty can violate the Constitution. Nevertheless, when you ratify a treaty, you have to be in compliance. So the UN sends investigators. They call them a special monitoring committee. So they investigated the United States on both the racial treaty and the civic and political rights, and they found the treaty outlaws hate speech, the race treaty, and so does the other one, the civic and political rights. Outlaws hate speech, but the United States, of course, has the First Amendment. So the UN monitor said, well, the U.S. is in violation. So there was some dispute about that. And what also they said the United States was not handling its border security properly along particularly along the Mexican border. There was this was civil and political rights. The United States was violating the rights, in other words, of people trying to get into the country illegally.
You're kidding me. Did they cite Mexico for the same thing?
No, just the United States.
Oh, just the United States. Okay.
There have been a series of lawsuits. I mean, the American Civil Liberties Union actually works with the Mexican government. They have their own treaty, you might call it. They have an agreement with the Mexican government, the ACLU, to work together against the U.S. Border Patrol. So they're firing lawsuits. That's what I fear. It's not, you hear about black helicopters coming. The UN is not strong, and they're not going to send forces to the United States to enforce their treaties. That's not how it would be enforced. It would be enforced by left-wing American lawyers going to court, and then judges giving them. For example, on this women's treaty, you can just look on the American Bar Association's website. They've got a book up there. It's like 200 or 300 pages of what the United States would have to do to comply with the UN Women's Treaty, which is going to come up for vote again in the next year or so. And basically they have it's a series of lawsuits. But one of the lawsuits is about a quota system. In other words, women, the issue that when the UN goes to Britain or Germany, these countries that have signed the treaty, they say, well, you have a British Parliament here of 500 members, but you only have 80 women, so you only have 12% or 15%. It's not 50%. For them, equality is what they call substantive equality of results. It's not equality under the law. It's not equality of opportunity. There actually have to be equal results on everything. And, this seeps into American law, American courts. Ruth Bader Ginsburg on the Supreme Court of the United States pointed out that India had a quota system, 50% women for certain issues on in certain institutions, and maybe she said that was something we could do too. That's becoming international law. So some judges and courts will say, well, this is now international law. The United States has to follow international law, even if international law is clearly either in conflict with the Constitution or it's controversial. It's a political issue. It should be decided democratically by the people. If they want a far left-wing policy, well, then at least let them vote in and not have it come from the courts or judges. So this is some of the dangers that we have with what's going on with what they call global governance. It's just about in every field. I say it's even border security or children or certainly the fighting of war. The International Criminal Court views most actions of the American military as a violation of international law. For example, part of the international law used by these global courts is that if you carry out an air attack, you have to warn civilians in the area before the attack. Well, this has never been the policy of the United States Air Force. In World War II, we didn't call Germany, before a particular air attack. If you warn even the military on their side, you're going to warn the military. You can't just warn the civilians. Israel's got in trouble. By doing this, they've warned people in Gaza, attack is coming, but then Hamas is ready for them. So they've suffered more casualties. So all of this is damaging both to domestic policy, ruling ourselves, and defense policy, how we defend ourselves. And I do have a chapter, by the way, on Israel in the book, and it shows how they're really on the front lines of the struggle against globalism. And the second is the United States.
You mentioned Israel just a moment ago here, and I just saw something in the Jerusalem Post where the European Union is trying to do something against Israel for the building of the settlements. I just saw that on the Jerusalem Post. They're trying to, do something in the European Union, sanctions or whatever.
Right. There's the program. The project is called, BDS, Boycotts, Divestment, Sanctions. Movement is to sort of delegitimize Israel. There's many in the European Parliament who would like to do this. The European Parliament has passed legislation against denouncing American security policies after 9/11. So, there are other forces in the the European Union who are friendly, but most of them, probably the majority in the European Parliament are in favor of these global rules, and they would like to control democratic United States, such as the United States and Israel, and to put some law above them. So there's many dangers that in this globalist attack on self-government. Ultimately, it's an attack on self-government, on the United States, on Israel. They don't have, in other words, they can't determine how to defend themselves.
Talking to John Fonte, Fonte. His new book is called Sovereignty or Submission. Will Americans rule themselves or be ruled by others? John, I don't know, you and I have not talked on this. I think the participation in the United Nations is almost worthless for the Americans and for the Israelis, because particularly, for we Americans. I mean, this kind of garbage comes our way every year. The things that the UN, a lot of their committees on human rights are a joke, because you have representatives of countries that are dictatorships on there. It's always anti-American. It's always anti-Israel. These things that are passed and talked about. It's on our soil in New York City. Why can't we just deal with nations one-on-one as the United States, as the world's lone superpower still, and forget all this? This is a big waste of time. Anyway. What do you think about my?
Well, I think a lot of it is damaging, and yes, we should cut back quite a bit. One idea is voluntary payment. Right now, the United States pays 22%, is sort of our due
of what
of everything for the UN, and maybe more. I mean, 22% is the assessed stock that we pay for specialized agencies. It's been proposed we just simply pay. We instead of having an assessment, it's voluntary payment. If they're doing something we like, if it's AIDS in Africa, if this is something we find worthwhile, we pay for that. If it's a Security Council resolution, it's some peacekeeping that we actually want, where we have a veto and so on, then we pay for it. The Human Rights Council, as you say, it's worthless, and it's worse than that because it's hostile. The countries involved are Iran, Cuba, Venezuela, and usually Israel is attacked constantly, the United States to an extent. So it makes sense not to be on the Human Rights Council and not to pay the 22% for that. So just that would be one way of solving it, would be voluntary. And, if they want to have a talking shop where everybody can meet, that there may be probably is little harm in that. If there's some place where every country in the world has their say, they talk, fine.
Well, that's fine, but they're trying to pass treaties all the time.
Right, no, the treaties should be opposed. and we shouldn't be paying for this. That's exactly right.
That's what, I think that's what the Americans have always traditionally thought about the UN. I mean, I've always, in the past, and before I was educated about what goes on now in the modern times of the United Nations, I would think, okay, United Nations is a place where the countries of the world can come and talk about issues and problems and try to peacefully resolve things if possible. And then secondly, if you're going to have a treaty, you have treaties between countries. The treaties usually end wars.
Exactly. No, this is a new I explained this in the book. This is a new type of treaty. Treaty used to be United States, Soviet Union, arms control. Right. You do this, we do that. You violate it, we get out of the treaty. This is we don't start abusing children because Saudi Arabia does or something. This is these are human rights treaties, which really aren't treaties. They're called. I mean, they use that term. They're called a convention, but it's just you promise to do something, and all these 180 countries that sign the rights of the child, everybody but the United States and Somalia, promise to do these things. But what they're promising to do is a problem. They're promising to give up parental rights.
But nobody's keeping up with whether Saudi Arabia abides by this stuff.
No, they send monitors out. Some of the Western countries, like Canada, Britain, they sign most of these treaties.
It's only is Israel or America are they doing it?
If they're not harassed.
Right.
The countries that do sign it are the Western countries, the democracies, are harassed. Like Saudi Arabia signed the Women's Treaty, and they say, well, we've signed it, but Sharia law takes precedence over anything, the UN has to say. So that's how they deal with it.
What about money? Do you see a time coming, John, when the United Nations is relatively a weak organization?
Yes.
It really is. But they get a lot of attention. But still, I'm not talking about necessarily the United Nations proper. I'm talking about these globalists, these people like George Soros and others who have an agenda to, I think it's an agenda to bring down America, at least as a superpower. Do you see a money, people trying to push, a sort of joint currency or something like that?
Yes, there's a bunch of, okay, that's what you mean, yes. Well, of course, there's the euro, which is a problem. It's not particularly good for the democracy in Europe, for the different states in Europe, so I don't know if there's going to be one part of the money is who's supporting this. I don't know if that's exactly what you mean. Like Soros is a big supporter of global governance.
Of a one-world,
American foundations.
Yeah. A one-world currency type idea.
I don't know if that would happen. I mean, the world currency. The dollar is the reserve currency. The euro is strong. There probably is there's some element to that extent. One money thing that's slightly different, I guess, is the people spending money promoting global governance are leading American foundations, the Ford Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Soros Fund. They're promoting all of this. So I'm besides worrying about the dictatorships and the bad guys in the UN, I'm also worried about Americans and Europeans and Westerners and left-wing Israelis who are involved in promoting global governance. This does include Soros, includes the ACLU, it includes the elements of the American Bar Association. They're all promoting global governance. Now, your question of a world currency, I haven't heard too much. That would be further down the line. So,
I guess maybe the fall of the euro.
The euro. They're all trying to prop up the euro because the euro is a currency not attached to a government, not attached to a nation. At least the dollar is still attached to to a particular nation. Even the Chinese currency is attached to a particular nation. But the euro is a type of international currency, but we see all the problems it has.
Right.
Because the Germans and Greeks don't have the same economic culture. They don't have the same political culture, and they work differently, and the whole thing is not working.
I think the euro is going to fail. It's on its way to collapse. But my point in bringing that up is that's an argument against a one world currency.
Exactly right. No, and you see what they're doing is doubling down. They're saying, well, we need more integration, more globalism because we have to save this euro. But I agree with you. I don't. The euro it doesn't work. First of all, so at some point it may collapse. But on the other hand, systems that don't work can be around for a long time. The Soviet Union never worked.
Yeah.
It was around for 80 years.
Yeah, they had tanks and guns to enforce it, though. The thing about with the euro is you do have these countries that, the Germans, they may be prosperous, but they're seeing the Greeks, have such high, have basically socialism that the Germans don't necessarily want to pay for.
That's right, and I do cover this in the book too. I have a chapter on the European Union and how they developed, how the democracies in Europe lost their self-government, and how the European Court of Justice became like a Supreme Court, and how power has been transferred from the elected representatives of the people, the different parliaments, to the bureaucrats in Brussels. So that's all explained.
But in their reaction, John, we're talking to John Fonte. His book, John's last name is Fonte. His book is called Sovereignty or Submission. Will Americans rule themselves or be ruled by others? Question mark. Published by Encounter Books. Isn't there a reaction, though, among the people of those various European countries?
Yes, there's a reaction has just been starting, and particularly the past year, the tremendous opposition in Britain.
Right.
And if there was a vote, they're talking for a referendum, they would probably vote to get out of the EU completely. They're not in the euro.
They use pounds, though, monetarily.
Yeah, they have their own currency.
In Britain,
right.
I'm talking about.
But within the EU, even in Germany, which for historical reasons has been in favor of integrating Europe because of their negative past, but even in Germany, the head of the German National Bank has said the euro is going to be a problem, although the government is still pushing it. The Merkel government is still pushing it. But across the board in countries in Central and Eastern Europe, even in France, in Germany itself, most people are not for this. And most Germans would like to go back to the mark, the German mark, which worked very well in the 70s and 80s. Before they had the euro, they were doing fine, too. So there is, you're right, there is a reaction, so we'll see. I mean, there's a reaction among the people, but just as in this country, the elites are in favor of this, and they're doubling down. They're promoting more European integration, less democracy, and more centralization.
Dr. John Fonte is our guest, and you can contact him, hudson.org. Dr. Fonte, I was thinking about Israel. And, of course, Palestinians just got observer state status at the UN. And I read something somewhere, now that they have that, they can get on different committees or something on the UN that could affect Israel or have some bearing on Israel, now that they have that observer state status. Can you talk about what that means? Or
Yes, one of the particular things is they could be eligible to join the International Criminal Court, which they're not. They refused to join that. The United States has also refused to join that. The reason we've refused, and Israel has refused, to make a long story short, the International Criminal Court has something like a international global prosecutor for war crimes, and they determine what are war crimes. So, you don't warn somebody before an air attack, it's a potential war crime. So if Palestine Authority joins, now that they're they have the same status as the Vatican, they're a non-member observer state, they might be eligible to join the International Criminal Court. If they do that, if some incident occurs on their territory, in the West Bank or in Gaza, particularly the West Bank is the Palestinian Authority, they could then charge Israel with war crimes, and since the incident took place on the territory of a country that has ratified, or an entity in this case, that has ratified the ICC, the prosecutor would be eligible to go ahead. So Israel would be subject to war crimes, or so would the United States. For example, Afghanistan has ratified the treaty, and the International Criminal Court was investigating American potential war crimes in Afghanistan. So this would be Israel is worried about this. We'll see what happens now. The Palestinian Authority said they won't do this right away. They won't try to join the International Criminal Court immediately, but they said they might further down the road. They might join them. So this is a danger. So we'll see. I'm pretty sure they will join them at some point.
John, I know the answer to this question before I ask it, but I think I know the answer. There seems to be, I know you don't deal in the supernatural here in your book, but there seems to be the attacks against Israel, the constant attacks against Israel by the United Nations and its members. They're not in it's inconsistent when you look at all the other injustices around the world that could be dealt with. I'm thinking about maybe perhaps the Chinese and the Tibetans.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you don't hear that in the news every day. You know, the Chinese are oppressing the Tibetans. The Chinese are oppressing the Tibetans. You don't hear that, you know, or what's going on in the Sudan. You hear a little about that, but it's every day. The Israelis, you know, are the bad guys. And why is it?
Well, that's a very interesting question, and you alluded to some other issues. In one chapter, I have a historical chapter, and there's a gentleman named Strobe Talbot. You may know him. He's president of the Brookings Institution now. He was Deputy Secretary of State under Bill Clinton, so he was the number 2 in the State Department. And he wrote about ancient Israel as well as modern Israel. He's very critical of Israel. He said Israel has always been, more or less aggressive, and this includes ancient Israel, you know, invading this territory, as he put it. And his sympathies go with with Israel's ancient enemies, the Babylonian kings, and so on.
Mm-hmm.
And he said the problem of modern Israel is the same. So we do see this animus going way back to the Hebrew Bible, actually. And I do discuss this a little bit, although you say it's not. It's all about the books about this world, and I don't discuss necessarily any supernatural discussion. But I do say that there's this attack on some modern critics have cited ancient Israel as also a problem, and they want to take Israel down a peg, and that includes the ancient biblical Israel as well as the modern Israel. So there is a connection here.
But you take Israel down another peg, they're not even on the planet.
Right. So that's they would. That's.
I mean, there's a tiny little dot on the face of the world globe, and it's just they're always in the news, and they're always the bad guys, and it really. I wanted to ask you one other question before we run out of time here. We've got about 4 or 5 minutes left here. How do you view President Obama and his administration? How in tune are they with these people you talk about in your book that are wanting to bring down American sovereignty? Is he and his team, are they as far left as these people?
Some on his team are, not everybody. So it's probably a mixed team. But I talk about a couple people in the Obama administration in the book. One is Harold Koh. He's the chief legal advisor to the United States State Department. He was the dean of the Yale Law School. He's an open transnationalist. In other words, he says he's openly, so that's one good thing, is he doesn't even try to hide it. He definitely would like to put global law above the Constitution. He's written on this. He's written extensively. It's all in the book. And he's the one who actually advises the president on what international law is. And he'd like to put international law above the Constitution. He was named by Obama to be legal advisor to the State Department. Another person named Anne Marie Slaughter was head of policy planning. That's like the in-house think tank of the State Department. She's left. She's gone back to Princeton. But there are many people, and Samantha Power is one of. There are many people in the administration who are part of what I call them transnational progressives. They say John Bolton called them the high-minded. So there are many people in there, and the other, there's a few people that aren't. Of course, he does use drone attacks to attack terrorists. So he's trying a balancing act here, but. I think his sympathies are probably toward a move toward more globalism, and that's the idea of the UN, is that someday they'll establish a global architecture, and all countries will be giving up sovereignty to international institutions that will rule for everybody. So he's sort of half and half at this point. The administration's half and half, and you can't quite tell the American people this, but you can play this game, which is a dangerous game. But I look at these people in the administration, and it's very worrying. Samantha Power in the National Security Council, Harold Koh, Anne Marie Slaughter, Susan Rice to an extent when she was. I mean, they're all talking global governance, international law.
See,
on the one hand, the other hand, they'll say, well, no, we're gonna get the terrorists with drones. So that's what's going on. But I certainly there's certainly a lot to worry about with the Obama administration.
This bunch in the people you just mentioned, the Obama administration is probably, I don't know what they're made up of, probably half these transnational sort of views, and then half of them probably traditional Democrats.
But that's right. That's a good analysis.
Whereas if you look at previous administrations like President Clinton, you would have very few of these.
Right. You'd have some, but fewer.
But fewer. But I just don't think President Clinton. I mean, he's a traditional American liberal, but I don't think he would be for a lot of this kind of stuff. But I don't know. I mean,
there's some. He's been ambiguous. He
Yeah.
said we have to think about the world for our grandchildren. We need some kind of global social system,
Yeah.
but not giving up sovereignty necessarily. So
Yeah.
he talks out of both sides of his mouth sometimes.
Really? Bill Clinton. I'll be darned. Never knew
Now,
that.
that actually, I discussed that in the book. This discussion he had with Strobe Talbot.
Thank you, John. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right. All right. Imagine that, a politician talking out of both sides.